According to Gizmodo.com, scientists have worked out how to protect more than a third of the world's oceans by 2030. In one of the largest studies of its kind, researchers mapped the global oceans, which cover almost half our planet, envisioning what a worldwide network of ocean sanctuaries could look like. Callum Roberts, a marine conservation biologist at the University of York, told the press, "This report shows how protected areas could be rolled out across international waters to create a net of protection that will help save species from extinction and help them survive in our fast-changing world."
Losing power when poles went down in a terrifying chain reaction. ABC's Maggie Rulli has more on the damage and a dramatic rescue effort.
Overnight, thousands in Seattle are left in the dark after more than a dozen power lines came crashing down, trapping 2 people inside a car and causing chaos as witnesses nearby scrambled to safety.
Wires down. They have about 15 poles down.
The car caught right in the middle, pinned and surrounded by a tangle of live power lines.
All I heard was this loud boom crashing, and then power lines are falling.
First responders rushing to the scene, desperate to turn the power off as rescuers worked to carefully pull the 2 people out, one taken away by stretcher. Another pole falling next to a museum, the power cut off with hundreds of visitors still inside. A stunned visitor capturing the moments. Terrified families with children were escorted out, passing the mangled wires.
Stay under the bridge.
The damage stretching more than a mile. Authorities cleaning up this morning, still unsure of what caused the poles to fall over.
The floodwaters are rising, and there are signs of more rain to come. Iran's government has ordered the evacuation of 6 cities in southern Khuzestan province.
We have moved our belongings to the rooftop. We have no choice. We are surrounded by water, and soon we are going to have to leave.
It's a tough sight to bear. A life's worth of belongings destroyed. But the immediate danger comes from the rising waters.
How can I take my family away from here, even if I want to?
For almost 3 weeks, heavy rain and flash floods have battered most of Iran's 31 provinces. About 1,900 cities and villages are affected. In Lorestan province alone, entire neighborhoods have been washed away. Families are taking refuge in emergency shelters. Thousands of kilometers of roads and farmland are damaged.
Now we have to make a choice between bad and worse, not between good and bad. For choosing bad, we have to pay a cost too, and the people are paying that cost.
Aid workers are struggling to reach at least 350 villages that are completely cut off. Iran's Red Crescent Society, the lead agency in the rescue efforts, is confronting yet another challenge in reaching those in need: U.S. sanctions. U.S. President Donald Trump renewed old sanctions and imposed new ones against Iran last year, accusing Tehran of not complying with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. His government has withdrawn from that agreement.
Sanctions impede the transferring of the money to the Iranian Red Crescent Society's account. So none of our foreign currency account is not working now. Because of the situation on the ground, there are mountains and there are some roads that are washed totally. So we have to use our helicopters. You can imagine how the relief operation can be impeded by the lack of the spare parts for helicopters.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has dismissed the allegations and blames the Iranian government for the damage caused by the floods. The European Union, UN agencies, France and Germany, meanwhile, have announced more funding and relief supplies for those affected.
In South Korea, where the government has declared a rare national emergency after a giant forest fire swept across the country's northeast, leaving at least 1 person dead and dozens wounded. The fire broke out late Thursday in the town of Gaesan near the DPRK border. Thousands of firefighters and soldiers have been deployed to contain the flames. The inferno has forced more than 4,000 people to flee their homes. President Moon Jae-in has told officials to take all necessary measures to extinguish the blaze and to cooperate with DPRK authorities if it approaches the border.
We are indeed deeply concerned by the military buildup that is underway in Libya and the escalatory rhetoric which seriously risks leading to an uncontrollable confrontation, and we call on all parties to immediately de-escalate the situation and cease all acts of provocation. We've said repeatedly that there can be no military solution to the Libyan crisis, and the current situation requires decision makers to act responsibly and finally put the national interest at first.
And Russia hopes the crisis won't lead to more bloodshed. Moscow says it does not support Libya's rival leader.
Israeli
Khalifa
Prime Minister
Haftar.
Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged to annex Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank if re-elected. He made the pledge in a televised interview 3 days before Israel's election. Netanyahu said Israel would retain control of the West Bank, imposing Israeli sovereignty without uprooting existing settlements.
I think everyone understands that the next term of office will be crucial. We will be able to keep our security and calm that is vital in the West Bank, which is 20 times bigger than Gaza. We left Gaza, and look what we've got. We would get Gaza in the West Bank. That is what is at
stake. The heat is sweltering, but these people in Chinamokondo in central Mozambique will queue for hours. They're waiting for food. One of them is Elsa Augusta. She says she lost her home and small farm to the cyclone and the floods. Elsa carefully shares the rice, beans and oil she's collected with her neighbors. She hopes these basic necessities will last 2 weeks. But with 7 mouths to feed, it's going to be difficult.
I feel a bit better because at least I'm getting some help. Throughout this time it has been suffering and more suffering. I was expecting help from the government.
People here usually farm rice, potatoes and maize. But those crops were lost to floodwaters up to 11 meters high. Now that the floodwaters receded, aid agencies are able to reach remote areas that 2 weeks ago were submerged. So far, the World Food Programme says it's helped 500,000 people, and in the weeks to come wants to triple that number. The floods not only devastated farms in Mozambique, but Malawi and Zimbabwe as well. The UN says 1.8 million people urgently need emergency humanitarian assistance.
It's the worst natural disaster that Mozambique has ever faced. And we knew that before even the cyclone, there were a very high level of malnutrition in the country. And those levels are really pushed to another limit. So it's quite critical to be here as soon as possible, as soon as we can reach those people, to provide assistance to everybody in this village, because these are farming communities. They've lost their crops.
The government estimates that more than 700,000 hectares of agricultural land has been flooded. People here say if they're to recover, they need seeds to plant as soon as possible. Without them, they fear they'll have to depend on help from outside when and if it
arguably the most
arrives.
advanced stealth aircraft in the world, a product of Lockheed Martin. Some of the plane's parts are manufactured in Turkey. Now, Turkey's decision to purchase Russian-made S-400 missile defense systems has not been well received in Washington, which in return announced its decision to halt the shipment of F-35 equipment to Ankara.
As a principle, it is contrary to international law for a third country to oppose an agreement between two countries and attempt to make other types of decisions. The whole world must see that the "I want this, it must be like this" mentality is no longer valid. We entered into this agreement with the Russian Federation. We're bound by this agreement. There's no such thing as giving or selling to a third country.
Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Israel is the only power who has the F-35 in its arsenal. And should Turkey get hold of the advanced jet, Israel would no longer have an edge. According to the 2014 United States-Israel Strategic Partnership Act, the U.S. is required to address Israel's capacity to respond to the improved regional capabilities provided by such sale or export, namely another Mideast state getting the F-35. The agreement could surely change the face of not only Israel's qualitative edge in the Middle East, but also America's edge over Russia, which begs the question, how likely is Turkey to cower to U.S. pressure and cancel its S-400 deal with Russia?
According to Reuters, Iran may put the U.S. military on its terror list if Washington designates the Iranian elite Revolutionary Guards as terrorists. The United States is expected to designate the Revolutionary Guards as a foreign terrorist organization, marking the first time Washington has formally labeled another country's military a terrorist group. A senior Iranian lawmaker said if the Revolutionary Guards are placed on America's list of terrorist groups, we will put that country's military on the terror blacklist next to Daesh.
report by Reuters on Saturday, federal and state officials in Louisiana are investigating a series of suspicious fires that destroyed 3 predominantly black churches in 10 days in one mostly rural parish. All 3 fires occurred at Baptist churches in St. Landry Parish, about 100 miles northwest of New Orleans. However, a spokeswoman for the Louisiana Fire Marshal's office said investigators have not concluded they were connected incidents. State Fire Marshal Butch Browning said investigators probing the St. Landry Parish fires were awaiting lab results but view the 3 blazes as suspicious.
Naveed Ahmadi is a 15-year-old Afghan who dreams of becoming a civil engineer. He missed a year of school while his family made its way from Iran to Greece, something he can ill afford if he is to enter university. Now he has enrolled in a high school on Samos, but some local parents don't want refugees like Naveed mingling with their children. One reason appears to be that refugees live in squalor. 4,000 of them are packed in and around a camp meant for 650. Naveed is lucky to live in a mobile home. For most, there is no proper sewage, no electricity, and no washing facilities.
We try to have the same life as we have in the past, but this is our situation. We can't do anything. It's the camp, and the camp is very dirty. We can't do anything.
Many refugees opt for informal education offered by private charities that also gives them a break from the difficulties of camp life. Formal education for refugees and asylum seekers is a recent development here.
When a representative from the Greek Centre for Disease Control came to talk to parents, he said we're looking at a public health time bomb. Children are basically unvaccinated. They get a single shot for measles, mumps and rubella. That doesn't meet school enrollment requirements.
Refugees who arrive on the Aegean Islands are kept here for much of their asylum process in case they have to be deported back to neighbouring Turkey. So they've been seen by many as a temporary population. When the government offered education to asylum seekers in 2016, refugees living on the islands were left out. But the asylum process is so slow, they are now stuck here for years. Last September, the government extended education to island refugees. About 30 have enrolled so far here on Samos, but as many as 1,000 are eligible. That's equal to 2/3 of the local Greek school population. Many of the people of Samos and other East Aegean islands consider that an unfair burden on their school system.
Samos, Chios and Lesbos have shouldered all the refugee burden for Europe's sake. We've been left to our fate and people are worn out. We don't have a problem with refugees. We've got a problem with those who are responsible for the situation.
Greece, and especially the islands of the East Aegean, act as Europe's buffer zone against irregular migration from Turkey. Most seem resigned to that fate. But here at the border, they want Europe to do a better job of demonstrating its humanitarian values.
Every day, hundreds of rubbish trucks make their way to Bantar Gebang, Indonesia's biggest landfill. All kinds of trash are dumped here, just 40 kilometers from the Indonesian capital, Jakarta. Scavenging is a 24-hour business here, and often involves more than one generation. 15-year-old Andriy left school 4 years ago to work in the dump site with his father. We asked him whether he would return to school if given a chance.
I don't know. It's too late for me. I'm already working here.
He says many of his friends are in the same position.
Thousands of families make their living by scavenging through this growing mountain of waste. It's dangerous, dirty work. They look for items they can sell, mostly plastic and aluminium cans, to recycling plants.
It's a hand-to-mouth existence, and many dream of a different future for their children.
How do you feel today?
Not far from the landfill is an informal school run by Reza Bonad that is helping to fulfill that dream. Reza's parents are not waste pickers, but she grew up here and knows what it's like to suffer what many would consider the stigma of being from the area.
We are living at the landfill, but don't let anybody to underestimate you. It's true, we live among the rubbish, but we are not rubbish. Condition.
That lesson seems to have been welcomed by the kids.
This school's helped me a lot. Reza often advises us not to give up hope. Even though we pick rubbish, we have to keep going to school.
It's a message the government is also keen to impart.
We have reached hundreds of families. We help pregnant women, children. We also have family development sessions. We meet the parents and we make them aware of how important it is for their kids to have an education.
These initiatives fill a gap. They may not be enough to keep every child in Bantargebang at school, but they're a start.
They are calling for a revolution. These protesters headed for the army headquarters in Khartoum, the latest in a wave of protests that began in December over the price of bread and escalated into calls for an end to President Omar al-Bashir's three-decade rule.
The longer it takes for al-Bashir to step down, the bigger the protests will get. And if you walk down in the street, you will see ages from 5 years old up to 50 or 60 years old. They're all coming out for the same thing. They want him to step down.
Security forces have responded to the protest movement with a fierce crackdown, killing at least 60 people since the protests began, according to an international human rights group. Despite the tough response to dissent, the protests continue. An activist posted this video of herself on YouTube.
We'll take back our dignity and we'll take back our country as well. The people's will is above everything. You need to understand that the people have spoken. That's it.
At one point, there were sounds of gunshots. Other than that, activists say the protests on Saturday were peaceful. President Bashir has stepped down as head of his ruling party in the hope of calming the protests. But the demonstrators insist they won't give up until he resigns as president.
And pulling a driver out of that car in Idaho, teetering on the edge of a cliff. That hero saving the driver and then disappearing. Here's ABC's Mar Scavocampo.
Tonight, Idaho police are thanking a Good Samaritan for a remarkable act of bravery caught on camera. 29-year-old Jason Warnock pulling a complete stranger to safety, a 30-foot drop below.
Well, I knew the goal was to get him out of there before, the possibility of the rig falling became a reality.
Police say 23-year-old Matthew Sitko was driving above Bryden Canyon Road in Lewiston, Idaho when he veered off.
She's just hanging by the fence.
When Warnock saw the SUV, he climbed the cliff to the vehicle, running 200 yards uphill before convincing the shaken driver to roll down the window.
Pulled him out and, gave him a hug. And we talked about God and if I was just the right spot at the right time to give a hand.